Hey folks, we're just given a few seconds here at the top for Zoom to let people in before we get started with tonight's event. If you are already in tonight's event with us, you can open up your chat window to find some information about how to purchase tonight's featured book. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Katie Engelhart presenting her new book, The Inevitable, Dispatches on the Right to Die. She'll be talking with Larissa MacFarquhar, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Katie, Larissa, and the team at St. Martin's Press for making this event happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now I have just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, The Inevitable, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Katie's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. You can find that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for tonight is Larissa MacFarquhar. She is the author of Strangers Drowning, Impossible Idealism, Drastic Choices, and the Urge to Help. She's a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, where she's written about domestic violence, dementia, philosophy, the child welfare system, John Ashbery, Barack Obama, and the Falkland Islands, among other subjects. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Katie Engelhart. She is a reporter and documentary film producer. She's also a national fellow at New America. She's worked as a correspondent for Vice News in London and NBC News in New York. Her new book, The Inevitable, is a riveting, incisive, and wide-ranging book about the right to die movement and the doctors, patients, and activists at the heart of this increasingly urgent issue. Interviewer Larissa MacFarquhar praises the book as an extraordinarily moving book that will change forever the way we think about the longing for death. Katie is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Larissa and with all of you. Katie, please take it away.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you to Larissa for joining me with this conversation. Thank you all for joining as well. I'm gonna read from chapter 2 of the book for those of you who have it or plan to buy it. It's page 61. In the late morning, on the day she planned to die, in April 2016, Avril Henry went to get the poison from the downstairs bathroom. She walked past the mustard yellow curtains and the frosted glass doors of the parlor, past the padded rocking chair where she sometimes sat for hours, with her feet tilted above her head, to ease the swelling in her ankles, she said. When she arrived inside, she steadied herself against the countertop before reaching up to the top shelf and feeling around for the glass bottles that she had hidden there, behind the toilet cleaner and the baby powder. Two of the bottles were small, like jars of cough syrup, and had Spanish writing on the labels. They contained the drugs. A third bottle held orange liqueur. Averil's suicide manual warned that pentobarbital had a bitter aftertaste and recommended chasing it with a bit of spirit. I got it imported illegally, Avril had said of the drug supply. It's quite easy to do, but very risky. She was at her home in Brantford Speke, a small village in southwest England with 300 residents, a pub called the Lazy Toad, a Church of England parish church, and a town council on which Avril had served several terms, earning a reputation as brilliant and steadfast, if sometimes needlessly adversarial. In her 80s, Avril had a loose, unformed aesthetic, all soft beige sweaters, soft beige skin, plastic clogs, walking aids, often dangly silver earrings, sometimes a dash of lipstick. By the time she planned to die, her white hair was so long that it nearly reached her waist. Things got stuck in it. Some fluff, a twig from the garden. In the mornings, it took no small effort for Avril to pull the hair back from her face and impose a kind of order on it, with hair elastics and bobby pins. By late morning, wisps of it would have escaped their restraints and fallen down around her forehead. Avril climbed upstairs slowly, as she always did, bent over and clinging to the banister, nearly crawling so that if she fell, she wouldn't fall far. Her walker was waiting at the top of the staircase, but she didn't need it. She was only going as far as the bathroom. It had always been Avril's intention to die in her bathtub, reclining and fully clothed. For weeks, she had worried that, in the throes of dying, her bowels would give way and that she would make a mess of herself, and then that the house would smell for weeks. By dying in the bathtub, she hoped to contain the mess. Just in case, she left a bottle of Dettol cleaning fluid under the towel rack for whoever came to mop up after her. She explained all this in the suicide note. "I'm about to take my own life," the letter read. "I am alone. The decision is wholly mine. This has been laboriously planned." When everything was ready, Avril called her internet provider to explain that even though she planned to kill herself at 7 p.m., she wished for her account to remain active until the executors of her estate had time to tie up loose ends around the house. Her longtime lawyer, William Mitchell-Moore, would later agree that this was a reckless thing to do, all things considered. But by then, Avril had already told her friends, her handyman, her caregiver, her gardener and his wife, and her acquaintances from the local swimming pool. She had read in some online forums that it was best to tell people about your death plans in advance. That way, they would be less traumatized by your suicide. Also, they would understand that you hadn't acted rashly on a very bad day. Rather, you had really meant to die and wanted to be dead. When Avril told her lawyer, he wasn't entirely surprised, knowing Avril's personality as well as he did. Her dignity was fully compromised by the disease, which attacked her nervous system, he told me later, as if dignity was a thing that could be broken by a body. Most people, Avril said, had taken the news well, though a few had not. One friend, a former colleague at the university, had even argued with her. "Have you considered the effect of this on your family?" he asked. "Of course I bloody well considered the effect," Avril said. Then she told him about all her aches and pains and untreatable conditions, and about her flagrantly incontinent bowels. He was appalled, she said later, delighted, and I'm glad he was. Her handyman, Jeff, who had observed in recent years that Avril was spending less time in the garden than she used to, found the whole conversation a bit surreal, but told Avril over a cup of tea that he did not, on principle, object to her decision. "I have no moral qualms about this at all," he said. Still, he asked whether the pain was that bad, whether this all wasn't a bit drastic. Avril brushed him aside. She said her suicide confessions were serious and final. They were not pretexts for sympathy, and they were not invitations for anyone to try to stop her.
Thank you. So I am so delighted to be doing this because this is a beautiful book and a really important book. And I really, really urge anyone who is watching this to buy it if you haven't already. It's hard to read. It's hard to read, but it is also even beautiful and even funny, as you just saw. So I was going to ask something else for the first question, but just before this started, we started talking, and Katie told me that there was only one of her major subjects who is still alive. And I asked her reaction to the book, and you haven't heard from her yet, but what do you think her reaction will be? This is
Yeah.
a woman named Maya.
Right. So one of my chapters is about a woman named Maya who's now around 40 years old. She has multiple sclerosis, so which is in a secondary progressive phase, which means that she is slowly but predictably losing control over her body, experiencing a lot of other symptoms. And she has plans, which I think over time she drifts further and then towards and then further away from, but she has plans to go to Switzerland to end her life at one of the country's famous suicide clinics. So she's the one person who I wrote about and who I really interviewed over the course of years who's still alive. I did send her a copy of the book, but I haven't heard from her yet. And I think she'll find it complicated. I think over the course of speaking with her, I had 5 years of her telling me that her suicide was just around the corner. She was preparing to take her life at any minute. And, 5 years have passed and that hasn't happened. And I think somehow that will surprise her to read in writing. I think she'll be surprised sort of by her own wavering.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you said at one point in the book that you, one of the many things that you worried about in doing this unusual reporting was that somebody might feel obligated in some strange way to follow through on their intentions, having talked about it with you, obligated to you. How did you think about that? And did you feel any whiff of that when you talked to anyone, either somebody in your book or someone who didn't end up being in your book?
Yeah. So in several situations with this book, I knew that someone had the intention to take their life before they did. In some cases, I knew specifics, sort of when the death would take place, how, who would be there to find the body or to find the body, and I didn't intervene, which was obviously a very difficult and loaded decision. I was nervous from the start by the idea that someone would be pushed towards death for the sake of my story. That once they got in a conversation with me, they would feel a sort of expectation to move towards death.
Right.
And in fact, Maya's father said as much to me on the phone. I think I'd been talking to his daughter for 2 years before he agreed to speak to me. And he said something very direct along the lines of, I don't want my daughter to die so that your book has a good ending. And I thought that was a very fair point for him to make. So I did have my own rules. I think they were imperfect, but when I began talking to anyone, I would really make it clear that I wasn't writing a book about people who were going to kill themselves. I was writing a book about people who were thinking about it, and that I had no stake in how their story turned out. I made it clear, I hope, to people that if they agreed to speak to me once, they weren't obliged to speak to me again and again. They could stop talking to me at any point. They could stop returning my calls at any point. And I did have some people who stopped, and I chased them a few times, but did eventually let them go. And then I think most importantly, I really chose to only talk with people who would let me into their lives, who would introduce me to people around them. I didn't want to get into a situation. This was more just self-protective. I didn't want to get into a situation where I was talking to someone who had plans and nobody else knew. That felt like too much to me. So in most situations, I spoke to a person's family member, friends. I mean, in the case of the woman in the excerpt I just read, spoke to her lawyer, I spoke to her gardener, her caregiver, her former colleagues at the university. I used, at one point, through Airbnb, was able to find some of her neighbors and speak to them. So I was really able to, make sure that anyone had the opportunity to tell me to stop if what I was doing was not helpful.
Yeah. Something I didn't know to expect when I started reading your book. I knew to expect stories like Avril's or Maya's. What I didn't realize is how many different kinds of participants in these plans you would find and talk to. And you said at one point that you were most fascinated by the exit guides or the death doulas, or the people who volunteered. I think they were volunteers to be with somebody when they were dying, just and at some risk of prosecution to themselves. And one that I was particularly thinking of is Brian. I wonder if you could tell us about him, because this is somebody who not only worked as a death doula, but also volunteered on a suicide prevention hotline, which is very interesting. And I wonder if you could tell me about him and how he made sense of those two kinds of work.
Yeah. So one of the groups that I write about, Larissa mentioned, is called the Final Exit Network. And they're basically, they're a very highly organized, highly structured group. They exist around the United States. They're a 501 registered C3 nonprofit, and they guide people who want to end their lives. They have their own quite strict criteria for who's eligible, but it's much more liberal than any right to die law that exists in the United States. So anyone can apply through their website, submit medical records. A panel of retired physician volunteers will review those records. If they're deemed worthy of help, they'll be paired up with 2 exit guides who will see them through their final days, weeks, months. So these are volunteers from all sorts of walks of life, and what they essentially do is teach someone how to take her life in a way that is painless and guaranteed. They use a kind of inert gas and a plastic bag, effectively, with a few other bells and whistles. And in some cases, they will travel across the country, instruct someone on how to take their lives, and then sit with them as they do it. So I'd heard about this network. Some news articles had mentioned it, and a few had spoken to a couple of guides that the network tended to put forward. I spent months meeting with people associated with the network, either current or former members. I think in the end I spoke to around 30 people, including the founders. And sort of at the end of my process, I met this guy named Brian Reuter. I think he's in his mid 70s. He's a retired corporate guy, and he'd worked, like a very white collar, proper job in Portland, Oregon, and now volunteers both as an exit guide and at a suicide prevention hotline. And that's an interesting contrast, that he's ushering people towards death and trying to prevent people from impulsively taking their lives, but he really sees them as 2 separate kinds of dying. And I think in my book, I try to hold them as separate, while looking at what space exists in between. So on the one hand, he sees despair suicides. Most suicides are despair suicides. People take their lives because of mental illness or an impulse and depression. And if you can stop them in the moment, if you can stop them on their really bad day, they probably won't try again. And then he sees this other kind of person who's a lot more deliberate and rational. I think in my book, I find that the line is not as clear as he makes it to be. But
can I ask you about that, actually? Because
yeah.
Philip Nietzsche, how do you pronounce his name?
Nitschke, yeah.
Philip Nitschke. Okay, yeah. So he's the early right to die laws, particularly in this country, are very narrowly circumscribed. You know, they have, as you mentioned, you know, they allow eligible people are really just people who are going to die in 6 months anyway, which is the same criterion for hospice care. And then you write about this guy, Philip Nitpick, who believes that this is just an arbitrary and arrogant limit, that who are doctors, who are lawmakers to decide when someone should be eligible to take their own life. And I was wondering, I mean, please tell us a little bit more about his beliefs, but also what do you think of that? Do you think there should be limits? If so, what should they be?
So Philip Nitpick, he's a hard man for me to describe. Usually as a shorthand, I'll say he's our modern day Jack Kevorkian. So he used to be a doctor. In the course of my reporting, he actually lost his medical license because he runs something he calls DIY death seminars all around the world. And effectively he travels around and he gives presentations. Most of the people in the audience are in their 70s and 80s, and he teaches them all the ways that they can take their lives in a way that is peaceful and quick and reliable. And he sees this as a kind of harm minimization. People are going to take their lives anyway. They might as well do it well, and they might as well have access to the best information. And over the course of really 5 years of knowing Philip, I saw just an enormous kind of philosophical shift in him. So when I met him, he had his own eligibility criteria for who should be allowed into his organization and who should be given his instruction. And it was, again, much more liberal than any law in any country, but still someone had to be 55. He thought that was reasonable, that they would have a certain amount of life knowledge by then. They shouldn't have a mental illness that is obvious to him upon kind of first meeting. Again, that's a really vague and imperfect guideline, but they should appear rational, and they should have something that is causing them pain and suffering, and so they should have a reason for wanting to die. And over the course of 5 years, he really shifted to a point where he doesn't think there should be eligibility criteria at all. I mean, his argument is really, life is not sacred, or the only way that it's sacred if you say it is, and if you don't want to live anymore, then it's your right to die, and you should be helped in the best way possible. He often says, life is a gift, but if you can't refuse a gift, if you can't decline a gift, then it's a burden. So he now will effectively offer anyone access to his suicide manual, which again offers information, but also phone numbers and email addresses for drug dealers in different parts of the world. And Philip's a complicated character. In my book, I tell the story of a young man in England who had really a long and tangled history of mental illnesses, and who on a very bad day, in a very bad month, used Philip's suicide manual to end his life. His family really believes that if that information hadn't been so easily accessible, then he would have stayed. But on the other hand, I'm sympathetic to the idea of challenging these criteria because they are set by lawmakers and they are enforced by doctors. So doctors in a place like California or Oregon will go through a very extensive process of reviewing someone's medical records and deciding whether or not they're worthy or not worthy, whether they deserve to die effectively. And I think it's a strange position we've put ourselves in, that we've given that authority to doctors, because in my research I found, and really the data shows, that people are choosing to hasten their deaths for reasons that are not purely physical. They're not choosing to die because they're in enormous physical pain in the moment. They're choosing to die because they don't want to lose autonomy, or they don't want to be a burden on their loved ones. So they're choosing to die for these existential reasons, and doctors have no special authority in that area. So because they are able to prescribe lethal drugs, we've given them this power to decide who's worthy and who's not. And I'm sympathetic to Philip's idea that this is not a role for doctors. And I think we actually saw some of this debate kind of come up in the early days of COVID, when, there was a lot of fear about about ventilators and ventilator rationing. And there were people who were saying, these rules should not be set by doctors. If anything, it should be a random panel of Americans who get together and decide who deserves ventilator access, because ultimately these questions will come down to problems that are not, easy to study in an anatomy textbook in medical school.
Well, it's interesting the way you've been talking about it just now, because you've been talking about it as a privilege to have access to this technology, to be able to die in a controlled way. But something that comes up in your book over and over again, which is very troubling, I think should be troubling to anyone, is that certain people worry that the right to die will inexorably become a duty to die, particularly somewhere like America, where healthcare regularly, medical bills regularly bankrupt people. There isn't universal free healthcare. And, there is a very real danger that people may worry that the emotional and financial burden of taking care of them it's their responsibility to remove that, either from their children or the state, or, people will worry that they are a burden and will feel obliged to die. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think these are very valid concerns. I think they're often raised in this context by disability rights organizations. I had a man named John Kelly, who's the head of a large group that opposes aid in dying laws, said to me, as a man with disabilities, I've been in a lot of situations where I'm, in the hospital and suffering, and doctors clearly think I would be better off dead. It would be just better if I was no longer suffering. And he feels like legislation will put that kind of implicit pressure. It will kind of emphasize that pressure. And I think certainly, in the United States context, especially, I found, things like money, bad access to healthcare did influence decisions. So, and in all sorts of ways. I heard of a patient who, she was going to die in the next year, but she chose to die sooner because she had limited savings and she wanted to leave the money to her daughter. And that was important to her, to leave that legacy. I heard of a man who was a Vietnam War veteran, and he hated the idea that his savings would go to a nursing home, and what he wanted to do was help victims of Agent Orange attacks that he couldn't stop thinking about. So money does enter the equation. One of the most interesting conversations I had in the book was in Belgium. I met a doctor named Wim Distelmans, and he's sort of, the New Yorker has written about him before, but he's a sort of larger than life celebrity doctor in Belgium. He's one of the leading champions of euthanasia and assisted dying. And he's involved in just a huge percentage of cases in Belgium, either as the doctor who delivers the injection or as a consulting physician. And I was talking to him about how the laws work in the United States, and he just interrupted me, and he looked completely disgusted. And he said, these laws absolutely shouldn't exist in the United States. He said, it's a developing country. Those were his words. And there's no way a country should offer this without, you can't offer someone access to death before you offer them access to healthcare. And definitely every other country that has assisted dying laws does have some sort of universal healthcare coverage.
So what do you think? Do you agree with him?
I think it's hard to say, because I think, and maybe this is just pessimistic way of thinking about things. But and I hope I believe that activists are working hard to reverse this, but the situation is what it is. In another context, I think a lot of Americans end up getting older at home, getting sick, being forced for different reasons, either by family or by financial necessity, into nursing homes. They spend their savings in a nursing home they hate. They live their final days in an institutional setting. I think it should be otherwise, but I think I understand why people look at that and want to avoid it. But I do think that it's an absurd sort of order of things to offer people, again, death before healthcare.
Well, you're sitting there in Canada, you can be smug.
True. It's true.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you. So in one case of somebody you wrote about, Adam Mayer Clayton, you said that you cut off contact with him at a certain point in your communication. Tell me about him. Can you tell us a bit about him and why you decided to stop talking to him?
So Adam Mayer Clayton was around 25 when we first connected, and he'd started getting a lot of attention in Canada because of an op-ed he wrote in the big national newspaper arguing that people with mental illnesses but not physical illnesses should be eligible for the country's assisted dying law. And he said he had this long history of anxiety and depression and psychosomatic pain and OCD. And because of that, he should be eligible to die under the law. And after this op-ed was published, he started getting a lot of pickup from Canadian journalists who would write short articles about how he was suffering, and how, a lot of op-ed writers in the country said that he had made a compelling case for the right to die to be extended to people with mental illnesses. So when I got in touch with Adam, he'd already become, as he put it himself, like the poster boy in Canada for this cause. And I found his story to be a lot less straightforward. So I spoke to Adam for, I think it was close to a year, and was also able to talk quite extensively with both of his parents, one of whom, his father, supported his campaign and thought he absolutely should end his life if he couldn't handle it anymore. But I also talked to his clinicians, his psychiatrist, his therapist, and Adam was really young, and there were things he hadn't tried yet. There were treatments and there were kinds of behavioral therapy that he hadn't tested to see if they would be effective on his conditions. But the reason I stopped talking to Adam was I had a sense that, first of all, he felt like he was in control of this narrative. He was shaping this narrative, and I was playing this role that he really wanted a journalist to play. Like, I was following his story, and he started leaving me voice messages on Facebook, asking me to call him, asking me to interview him, telling me that he was keeping diaries and collected a lot of compelling material, I think is how he put it. He said really, really moving material. And I felt like whatever was happening, it wasn't healthy for him. And I felt, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I felt a kind of narcissistic energy coming from him that really frightened me. And I knew that he really, really wanted media coverage, and that made me scared to give him media coverage. And I'd gone out of my way, even at the beginning, to be very careful with Adam. So when after the first time we spoke, I asked him if I could speak to his father as well to kind of get his blessing. And that was a decision I questioned later, whether I was infantilizing someone with mental illnesses. who was 26 years old and who had agreed to speak with me by asking to speak to his father, but I had been very careful. But no, in the end, I told him I thought it was best if we just kind of paused contact for a while. And Adam did end up taking his life using drugs that he procured from strangers on the internet. And I had this very weird experience afterwards of getting in touch with one of the therapists that he'd mentioned, a psychologist that he'd mentioned in our phone call. And when I got the therapist on the phone, he said, I've been waiting for a call like this. Adam told me that journalists would be calling me after he died. And he said that I should speak to them and tell them everything. And I don't actually know whether that legally entitled the therapist to tell me what he did, but certainly it actually just reinforced my decision that I wasn't being helpful to him by continuing to talk to him.
Yeah. Well, it's so difficult because, I mean, you mentioned, and I didn't realize this, that there is a norm in journalism not to write about suicide or to write about it in a very particular way, because it's been known for, as you write, for 3 centuries that it's contagious. It's writing about suicide can produce it in people who read about it. And I wonder, I mean, you are so sympathetic and so respectful of the people that you describe in your book. I was wondering if you worried that would have that consequence, that someone reading your book might take courage from your sympathy and your respect and imitate them.
Yeah. I take some issue with some of the prohibitions on reporting. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we want to stop despair suicides and we don't want to trigger someone who's vulnerable into acting. I do think some of the guidelines were written before the internet existed, when it's quite possible that no one would have heard of a suicide method until they picked up The Inevitable by Katie Engelhart. And I don't think that's true anymore. Everyone I spoke to had done research online. You know, I met 80-year-olds who taught themselves how to download dark web browsers and go to places I don't know how to access, and they'd done the work and they had nothing to learn from a newspaper. But I did think a lot about this. It was difficult because I don't feel like I feel like many of the people who I spoke to, they weren't killing themselves in despair or out of impulse. And so it felt like I was describing something that was a little bit different. There's one study that I'm aware of that looks at whether reporting on assisted dying, like legal assisted dying, leads to non-legal suicides. And the verdict is sort of out. I think an American paper actually said it might influence suicides, and a Canadian paper using the same data said that it didn't. So I did think about that, but again, it felt like what I was describing was different. And I'm very averse to reporting on death and dying that is filled with euphemism. I don't think it's helpful to anyone.
Could I ask you
that? But the book is graphic. Yeah.
You mentioned to me that you said you deliberately used language in the book that would be opposed by the big suicide prevention advocacy groups, and that you wrote about suicides in detail. I didn't know exactly what you meant by that, so that's interesting. I mean, could you tell me about that decision and how you thought about it?
So yeah, I mean, I wrote about method, for instance.
Right.
So which is interesting. You know, my part of the book was there was an excerpt that ran in The Guardian last week, and they took it all out. And there was a long back and forth with the editors, and I said, you know, A, your newspapers covered this before, but B, this information is not new to anyone who wants it. My book has drug names and it has descriptions of plastic bags and all sorts of other things, but they didn't want it in there. I use phrases like kill himself, which I think we've stopped using. In the case of like a despair suicide, we would say that someone died by suicide, because it's seen that the suicidal impulse is a kind of, you know, it's a product of mental illness. So they died by suicide, this thing took their life, rather than this is an act that they carried out themselves. But in the case of the people I met, like, the whole point was that they were doing it themselves. So to put this act that they'd spent months or years preparing, that I'd spent, weeks and months following, to put that into the passive voice just felt really untrue to the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't use it. And I tried to be as specific as possible. There were things I left out. I mean, I didn't want to be gratuitous. So, I didn't describe the state of bodies and how they were found, although I know in some cases a lot of detail. And there was one story that I scrubbed down a bit. I mentioned earlier that I did write about one suicide that I think fits the more typical despair suicide we hear about, a young man who suffering from really severe depression who took his life. And I was a lot more careful. I sort of stuck to the rules more with that one. And I checked more with his family about what could go in the book and what couldn't. So in my original draft, for instance, I had a description of an object that was in his hand when his body was found, and his family asked me to take it out, and I took it out. And they were worried about copycats. And ultimately they were
Right.
they didn't like that his story was put in a book, in a book and in a collection of stories about assisted dying. They felt like it was, that he was being used as an example for a book that was about something different. And that was difficult.
I want to ask you just one more question. So I should tell everyone watching this, please put questions in the Q&A. I just want to ask Katie one more question because she brought up something super interesting, but please put questions there and we'll go to them in a second. I wanted to ask you, you've recently written a really extraordinary piece in the Times about dementia. And as you write in the book, dementia brings up a very, well, all of these are difficult questions, but another difficult question to do with assisted dying, which is, many people, as we all know, dread the prospect of advanced dementia and say, I would rather be dead than go through that. But somebody who has advanced dementia may not have any desire to die, may be perfectly happy. And so then the question is, are these different people, and should the person with dementia be governed by the person they used to be, who perhaps signed a living will or left instructions that they should be, under these circumstances, euthanized? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it strikes me that we have to do something for people with dementia. I mean, more than anything else, just people told me that they would rather die than have dementia. And people who are diagnosed, they have no options for a cure. They could live for years in a condition they don't want to be in. They feel very alone. They feel very abandoned by a medical system that can't help them. So I'm taking this call from Canada, and actually the government is, right now debating an extension to the federal aid in dying law that would allow people to write a kind of advance directive saying, I have dementia, and when I get to the point where I don't recognize my husband anymore, where I don't know who I am, where I'm nonverbal, I would like to receive a lethal injection. And it wouldn't surprise me if this passes. The one poll I've seen suggests that Canadians are in favor of it, but it's very difficult. So that is legal only in one country, in the Netherlands, and doctors they're so hesitant to participate. And a lot of people who write advance directives, in the end, their doctor won't do it. And it comes down to the question of suffering, as you say. Is someone in an advanced state of dementia suffering? Can they be said to suffer? Doctors sometimes feel like that question is unclear in the moment. And so they're unwilling to, the law could theoretically require them to inject someone who's smiling, who's laughing, who seems to be enjoying a different kind of quality of life. On the other hand, critics will say that, once again, this is doctors exerting authority over a decision they know nothing about, that they're disrespecting the autonomy of their patients. They would argue that the authentic patient is the patient as she existed before she lost her memory, who was able to state clearly what her wishes were. Even the country's main right to die organization has said, I think the quote is, act at 10 minutes before midnight instead of waiting for 10 minutes after midnight. Kind of do it yourself before doctors get involved. And that's very complicated too. So in Belgium, someone who's in an earlier stage of dementia can get an assisted death, but that really means they lose good time. They lose because they have to be cognizant and aware of stating their desires on the day of their death. And they don't know when they'll lose that. So they end up dying sometimes months or years before they really want to. So there's no perfect solution, but I really can't tell you how many people I've met who say, I'll kill myself if I have dementia, I'll help my mother, I'll help my grandfather. They may or may not mean it. I went down a strange reporting rabbit hole when I was thinking about this, and I just found a lot of stories on local news channels about usually couples, elderly couples. Usually the wife would get dementia and the husband would murder her out of mercy, he would say later, and out of love. And sometimes those men were prosecuted after the fact, or they certainly risked prosecution for some time. And I mean, those stories are not uncommon, actually. So
Right.
we can continue to, I think it's something that needs to be talked about, because I think, again, people will do this anyway, but how can we make them feel like they're doing something that is still dignified and safe? I think it's very complicated.
Right. It's incredibly complicated. I want to go to these questions that are in the Q&A. Someone named Claire said, Katie, did your own mental health waver at all during this process?
I think, certainly when I was with the people who I write about in the book, it was really very important to me to maintain the same level of professionalism as I would for anyone else. I didn't want to be more emotional or more, just kind of more emotive than I would be in any other story. It felt unfair to them because the subject was so serious. I really wanted them to feel like I was this kind of neutral person that they could just pour out whatever was in them without worrying about reaction from me. But it was very challenging, particularly I think after people died. I was sort of surprised by every death, even though everyone told me what they were going to do and they told me the method, and I spoke to the friends who agreed that it was going to happen. I was always sort of surprised that it did. I never thought, for instance, that young man Adam would actually take his life, even though he told me he would, very clearly. So I think, I think it was difficult to write a book for so long about decisions that are so serious, so consequential. I found that was just a lot of intensity, and then it was hard to move between assignments where it was just kind of normal levels of sadness and trauma. It was a lot of intensity to be living with for 5 years.
Yeah. Someone named Barbara asks, please tell us more about what you label the euthanasia underground.
So I kind of use that term loosely. It actually just comes from activists themselves. I think it probably best refers to a network of activists who are working to educate people about ways of taking their lives, and in some cases, activists who help. So some of these groups are very informal. They exist on the internet, they share information. I know there's kind of loose collectives of people who will help each other secure certain lethal drugs that are particularly sought after. So Adam, who I just spoke about, for instance, I know someone on the internet, I don't know the specifics, but someone on the internet who he connected with sent him drugs that he did use to take his life. And then some of the groups like the Final Exit Network are highly regimented. And, again, we have professional former white collar workers traveling around the country, sitting beside people when they put plastic bags over their heads. So I just use that term to describe the whole group. I was really surprised to find a lot of organizing, but I think it was a mistake to be surprised, because I think whenever the law and the medical system fall short, people will find a way. Ultimately, to take one's life, it's not rocket science. It's something that it requires some knowledge, but people can teach themselves, and they are teaching themselves. And I think that their doctors probably know it's happening in some cases and look the other way.
Right. Someone named Margaret says, we are about to pass access to MAID for mental disorders with an 18-month to 24-month sunset clause in Canada. I take it that you will know what that means. Do you think anyone can differentiate what you call despair suicides from a request for MAID from someone with a mental disorder? What other than despair would lead to the request?
So MAID is medical aid in, MAID is medical aid in dying, and so it's just legal physician assisted death. And so yes, Canada is planning to expand the law to people with mental disorders who are not suffering from specific physical disorders, cancer, heart disease, whatever, but they're putting a pause on it, so that typically state laws require this. Someone wait, say, usually 10 or 15 days between making a request and actually dying. But in this case, when it comes to mental illness, there's going to be a much longer waiting period, and the law will kick in later. I think when I first started researching, I assumed that I kind of believed what I'd read from the critics, and so people will say, by virtue of having a mental illness, someone's thought process is disrupted, someone's ability to make a decision and to reason is corrupted, and thus they should not be allowed access to something like aid in dying. Physicians have said that, psychiatrists especially have said that to participate in an assisted death for someone with, say, severe depression is akin to collaborating in a patient's suicidal despair. But medical capacity, legal capacity is different from what people expect. So when your capacity is not kind of holistic, someone doesn't have capacity in a general sense or not have capacity. Capacity is judged at a specific time related to a specific choice. So does someone have the capacity to make this specific choice about their healthcare, about whether or not they wish to die? And already, people with a range of mental disorders make all sorts of decisions about their lives, whether to get married, whether or not to buy a house. And that's because we judge them to have capacity to make those decisions. So I'm also sympathetic to the view from certain mental health advocacy groups. They say we've worked really hard to prove over the years that mental illness is serious. It's real. It can be just as bad as physical illness, and that someone who's suffering from mental illness is not irrational. They're suffering from a disease, and they should have access to personal choice. I think the laws that will potentially exist in Canada, and as it exists in several European countries, it really requires that someone have suffered for a long time, that someone have tried a certain number of treatments and a certain number of therapeutic methods and had them fail. Ultimately, I'm really wary of where this law could go. When I was in Belgium, I write about a group of women I met, and I met women as young as 29 who'd been approved to die because of histories of depression. And I don't know, I guess my impulse was maybe there's something left to try, but then again, maybe I'm just falling into the trap of claiming that, if a patient tries hard enough, they can get better. I don't know really where I should fall on this. I will say, it's not that easy to draw a line. Sure, and if we're looking at what makes someone eligible, we can put mental illness here and physical illness here, but already lots of people with mental illnesses get physician-assisted death, because people with depression get cancer, and people with, obsessive compulsive disorder get heart disease and will qualify to die in that way. So already mental illness is playing into the equation.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bit of an equivocal answer. I'm anxious about it.
Did you change your mind at all? Did you change your mind about this at all? I mean, where did you start and where?
Yeah, I'm anxious about how patients will be evaluated. I think going to Europe, where this is already legal, I just saw, I saw the possibility for problems that I hadn't anticipated. So in that country, you really see a divide in psychiatry between psychiatrists who think that this is right for patients to have this access and psychiatrists who don't. And so then what you have is patients doctor shopping. So hopping around until they find one of several physicians who will say yes. And you have psychiatrists who are now involved in, more than a quarter of these kinds of euthanasias in the country. They just become specialists. And I think that's possibly dangerous. But then again, I think people have the right to say enough is enough, and whether they're suffering physically or in other ways. I mean, I think the right to life can become a duty to live if we are always working with the goal of keeping people alive. So I guess I'm willing to see what the Canadian law looks like and whether it can bypass some of the shortcomings of the European system.
Well, on that note, Greenlight suggested that we end right on time, and so I think we should. Though I would love to ask you questions for hours more. Please, everybody, read this book. It stays with you for a very long time, and thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much for
everyone
being in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie and Larissa, for tonight's really lovely, thoughtful conversation. And thank you again, everyone, for spending this time with us and for making this space for this conversation. A reminder, if you missed any part of tonight's event, or if you'd like to rewatch or share, it'll be up on our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore, within the next few days. So keep an eye out there and on our social channels. And like Larissa said, if you don't already have a copy of Katie's book, you can buy The Inevitable through Greenlight Bookstore. If you're local to Brooklyn, we're open noon to 7 for limited capacity browsing daily, or you can shop greenlightbookstore.com. You can find the book buy link in the chat for local curbside pickup or for shipping anywhere in the US. Thank you so much again, everyone, for tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.